Many of us enjoy examining the amazing paintings and engravings by famous Ruinists such as Piranesi, Hubert Robert, Panini, and other masters of the past. Officially, it is considered that these works were created in the style of capriccio, a genre that allows for architectural fantasies and a free mixture of reality and fiction. But beyond the art of creating engravings, there is also the art of studying them. The abundance of details and tiny strokes often scatters one's attention, and it becomes hard to understand where to look and what exactly needs to be seen. Far from all symbols and allegories lie on the surface. However, if we discard the museum captions, which often contradict the very meaning of what is depicted, and stop attributing everything to the artist's wild imagination, a very clear and frightening image begins to emerge before us. An image of how people lived after a global catastrophe. If we stop blindly trusting the captions and dates and simply analyze the setting captured in these works, it becomes obvious. Perhaps we are not looking at the inventions of painters, as historians claim, but at a documentary chronicle of the daily life of survivors. Before we begin our deep dive into this hidden world, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us continue to uncover the secrets of the past. Looking at these canvases without prejudice, we see a world devoid of the logic of prosperity we are used to. The artists, whom we can assign to the first group of observers, paint dirty ruins overgrown with grass and trees. The people in these pictures do not care about aesthetics at all. They hang their laundry wherever they can because their main goal is survival here and now, not posing for future generations. Their clothes lack elegance. They cook food on bonfires, and they wash clothes right in the former town squares, or rather, on what remains of the town. Crooked fences are constructed from rotten boards, serving simultaneously as housing and pens for livestock. There is a persistent feeling that control over technology has been lost. The instructions for these majestic structures perished along with the previous civilization. In so-called temples, where energy was likely generated in the past, uncontrolled fires and incidents now occur, because the new inhabitants of these places do not understand the principles of the mechanisms they inherited. Someone tries to earn a living by playing simple instruments near a makeshift station, an occupation that will later be called begging. Groups of people resembling gangs roam the streets, and any romance of antiquity is completely absent here. This is a harsh reality where the grandeur of architecture contrasts with the squalor of daily life. However, if we continue our analysis, a strange contradiction emerges. There is a second direction of Ruinists whose works differ radically in mood. They, conversely, depict clean, washed, and picturesque ruins. Amidst these sets, we see well-dressed people who look more like visiting tourists than catastrophe survivors. The themes of such paintings are elevated, and the ruins act merely as a background for spiritual or philosophical scenes. Here, there is no soot, no dirt, no bonfires. The maximum destruction is a light crack added for ambiance. To see the true picture of the past, it is necessary to understand why artists depicted the same catastrophe so differently, and what lies behind this artistic dissonance. If you're interested in learning the truth about forgotten technologies of the past, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the solution to this story, because what you've just learned is only the tip of the iceberg. There were far more metal roads than you can imagine, and their fate hides even stranger facts. It feels as though the artists we tentatively placed in the first group acted as impartial chroniclers, recording real life immediately after the disaster. Their canvases are saturated with the atmosphere of recent horror, which gradually turns into a heavy routine of survival. Time passed, the shock of the events faded, life inevitably recovered, and people began to have resources again. It was then that travelers appeared on the scene, setting out to inspect the places that suffered the most. Effectively, these were the first excursions to sites of past glory that had turned into ruins. And it seems it was this stage that was captured by the painters of the second group. the decorators, whose works are filled with calm and majestic melancholy. People walked on these roads, rode on them in carts and carriages, saw them every day. But no one considered it necessary to write down where they came from, or were the records destroyed later? Or is there some other explanation that's so incredible it was preferred to be silenced? To understand the full absurdity of the situation, we need to look at how real roads were created in the past, what technologies were used, and how much they differ from modern methods. In their paintings, it sometimes seems that scenes from ancient life are being specially reenacted for idle tourists, much like modern hotel animators portray the traditional life of ancestors to entertain the public. Here, ruins serve only as decorations for spiritual and philosophical conversations, devoid of the tragedy of reality. However, if we return to the works of the realists, the contrast becomes stunning. The first thing a person needed in the conditions of a destroyed civilization was not philosophy or the contemplation of beauty, but a simple roof over their head and food. The survivors adapted any available ruins for housing. Majestic villas and palaces, once shining with luxury, turned into communal shelters. In halls where music once played, bonfires are now lit to cook stew and keep warm, causing the ceilings to be covered with a thick layer of soot. One can find images where, amidst the chaos of debris near a ruined rotunda, pots of flowers suddenly stand. Nearby, a covered shack is nestled, built from the remnants of past grandeur, apparently intended for livestock. This is a clear sign that people live here permanently, trying to organize their daily life somehow. If weary travelers were passing by, the local inhabitants would likely invite them into such an improvised home. Scenes of winter moves or forced migrations attract particular attention. We see houses without glass. The technology for its production has apparently been lost, or is inaccessible. Remnants of dome frames stick out above chimneys, and walls are riddled with cracks and traces of fire. People are dressed in a strange mix of items. Someone might be wearing a short-sleeved dress in winter, indicating a shortage of warm clothing. One gets the impression that the belongings they carry were not carefully packed for a planned move, but were grabbed in a hurry from a fire or found in the vicinity. These are things taken on the principle of whatever survived, without regard for style or size. Yet, even in this chaos, a desire for settlement is traceable. We see added staircases and roughly cobbled together doors on the second floors of dilapidated buildings. Sometimes a strange architectural contradiction is encountered. Massive stone walls of an antique type are covered with a primitive straw roof. People used the surviving shells of buildings, but they had to cover them with makeshift materials because engineering knowledge had been lost. Small structures resembling rotundas are added to the roofs, possibly adapting the remains of previous constructions. And right there, amidst this ruin, one can notice elements of domestic plumbing, stone bathtubs, and again, flower pots. Touching attempts to preserve a human semblance in inhuman conditions. These scenes resemble abandoned gardens that many might have seen during periods of economic decline. Crooked, half-rotten tree branches in the centers of compositions show that no one has tended to the vegetation for a long time. People keep domestic animals right inside former palaces, living with horses and goats under one roof, since the space of the huge halls allows it. In some images, the process of clearing rubble is visible, testifying to the presence of at least some self-governance. However, the titles of such paintings often confuse the unthinking observer, speaking of demolition or reconstruction, even though the visual evidence screams of the aftermath of a catastrophe. Anyone who has seen a real building demolition knows the construction debris is gathered into neat piles, but here, absolute chaos reigns. Roofs look as if they were sheared off by an unknown force, and traces of fire are everywhere. People in these canvases are often busy excavating, descending into underground galleries with torches. Obviously, they are looking not just for shelter, but for necessary items left by previous owners. However, if you look closely at exactly where these survivors prefer to settle, it becomes clear. Their choice is not accidental. They instinctively gravitate towards places where, despite the destruction, remnants of technologies unknown to them still function. Technologies they use, but can no longer control. The main question in this story sounds simple, but there's no answer to it. Why are there no historical records about these roads? We're talking about mass construction, about the use of huge volumes of metal, about technology that was applied everywhere. How can you build thousands of kilometers of metal roads and not leave a single mention in the archives? No blueprints, no descriptions of the technology, no cost estimates, no construction reports, no mentions in newspapers of that era, no memoirs of engineers or workers. Complete informational silence around a grandiose engineering project. This looks not like loss of documents, but like deliberate destruction of all mentions. Upon closer examination of the surviving evidence of that era, another important aspect of the survivors' lives becomes apparent, one that is rarely noticed. Many images feature an unnaturally large amount of water. It is likely that people settled precisely where ancient technical water supply systems continued to function. Underground water conduits and channels, into which rivers like Moscow's Neglinka were encased, maintained pressure, providing the ruins with a vital resource. Majestic rotundas, which art historians are used to considering merely architectural ornaments or gazebos, likely served in the past as water collection columns and complex fountain systems. After the destruction of the main infrastructure, women adapted these engineering nodes into laundries, utilizing the powerful streams of water bursting to the surface. This indicates that pumping stations or other pressurizing mechanisms were still working in autonomous mode, even though no one was managing them anymore. However, life next to uncontrolled technology carried deadly danger. Imagine a situation similar to modern nuclear power plants left without personnel. They function automatically for a while, but then failures, accidents, and energy releases inevitably begin. It seems this exact process is captured in canvases describing strange fires and destruction. Official painting titles often mislead, offering simple explanations that crumble under logical analysis. Consider, for example, the images titled Fire at the Opera Palais Royal. If we believe the title, we are looking at an ordinary fire, but logic suggests otherwise. The building's walls remain suspiciously clean, devoid of soot, as if just washed by rain, while the roof is sheared off with geometric precision, as if by a giant blade. In an ordinary fire, the roof collapses inward chaotically, but here we see a clean cut, characteristic of a directed blast wave or a high-energy beam. Moreover, instead of black clouds of smoke from burning wood and fabric, thick white steam or gas rises into the sky, which looks more like a chemical reaction or a release of excess pressure than the burning of organic matter. Similar inconsistencies are observed in scenes titled Demolition of the Church or other structures. If we assume this is a planned dismantling, the behavior of the people in the foreground is baffling. Idle spectators sit and watch the process without any protection, as if at a theater. With an organized building explosion, a cloud of dust always forms, and the structure settles vertically downwards. Here, we again see clouds of white smoke, identical to those rising over the opera. This suggests that we are not looking at a demolition, but an emergency release of excess energy. The system, deprived of maintenance, overheated, and the mechanisms hidden in the bowels of the temples, which may have been stations for atmospheric electricity or wave energy, began to fail. Sometimes the destruction process went even further. In images of landscapes with cascades, one can see water suddenly gushing in huge streams while people flee in panic. Inside the structures, not just fires, but real explosions occur, with the epicenter often located exactly in the center of a rotunda. This confirms the hypothesis that the buildings stood on underground tunnels and were part of a unified energy system. When control was finally lost, the hidden communications began to detonate, spewing columns of steam and water to the surface. Survivors became witnesses to the agony of the technosphere, which they did not understand and could not fix. While some fled in terror from the exploding remnants of past grandeur, risking death under the rubble, others, years later when the dust had settled and the dangerous processes had quieted, began to look at these majestic ruins with a completely different gaze. The gaze of enterprising businessmen ready to turn the tragedy of the past into a profitable business. The irony of the situation is obvious. The technology used by illiterate society is orders of magnitude more complex, thoughtful, and effective than modern methods. Multi-layered structure taking into account loads, drainage, thermal expansion versus simple pouring of hot asphalt on a prepared surface. Even without special education, it's clear which method is more perfect. Moreover, we see something very similar in the famous Roman roads. The same multi-layered structure, the same principle from large fractions to small, the same stone laying on top. And these roads serve for millennia. Literally 2,000 years later, you can still walk and drive on them. Modern asphalt begins to crack and sag after just a few years of operation. A logical question arises. Who was actually more technologically advanced? Those who created roads for centuries, calculating each layer and each element of the structure? Or those who patch holes with bricks and hope it lasts until next season? Official history claims one thing, but facts speak completely differently. If you look more broadly, metal roads fit perfectly into this picture. They represent another level of technological perfection that modern civilization not only cannot reproduce, but cannot even explain. Why use metal for road surfacing? What advantages did this provide? What technology allowed producing such volumes of forged iron? But metal roads turned out not to be the only mystery associated with the use of metal in the past. There are other examples that raise even more questions and destroy familiar notions about the development of technology. This strange and frightening chronology becomes even more confusing if we pay attention to the life dates of the artists themselves. Here lies a paradox that official art history explains only by a difference in styles, but which, under logical analysis, looks like a deliberate falsification of the timeline. The artists of the second group, those very decorators who depicted clean, sunny ruins and carefree tourists, according to official data, often lived and worked before the masters of the first group, who documented the dirt, devastation, and struggle for survival. But the most amazing thing about these metal structures isn't even their purpose or scale of application. The most striking thing is their condition in which they've survived to our days. For example, Giovanni Paolo Panini, whose canvases are filled with light, fashionably dressed people, and majestic calm, lived from 1691 to 1765. But Hubert Robert, nicknamed the Painter of Ruins, whose works often show soot-covered vaults, drying laundry, and wild vegetation, lived later, from 1733 to 1808. An absurd picture emerges. First, the ruins were a clean tourist attraction, and decades later, they suddenly became overgrown with dirt and inhabited by beggars? Logic suggests the opposite. First comes the catastrophe and survival, and only then, generations later, comes the stage of clearing and tourism. A well-founded theory arises that the chronology was intentionally distorted. History was rewritten to present the global catastrophe as a matter of the distant, antique past. If one admits that the destruction happened recently, the picture of the stable development of civilization collapses. Therefore, the biographies of the early Ruinists might have been shifted back in time to create the illusion that these buildings were already ancient monuments in the early 18th century. The catastrophe needed to be aged, turned into a safe myth about the fall of the Roman Empire, unrelated to modern times. In the paintings of this supposedly earlier, but logically later group, the atmosphere changes radically. The sky in them is always blue, with light white clouds. The air has cleared of dust and the chemical smog that hung over the cities in the early years. People no longer look like refugees. We see characters in expensive camisoles sewn by professional tailors, and ladies in lush dresses. These are tourists. They come to the ruins not to seek shelter or food, but to listen to stories. Often in the center of the composition, one can spot the figure of a guide, a person who inspiredly tells the gathered crowd about the great past, emperors, and gods. However, the reaction of the locals in these paintings is quite telling. Women who have come to the spring for water or local workers often look at such a speaker with skepticism, or even an attempt to stop him. Being descendants of the survivors, they know the true, much more prosaic and terrible history of these places, and they clearly dislike what the guide is selling to the gullible travelers. But the process has already begun. History is turning into legend. The ruins on these canvases look well-groomed and, most importantly, commercially successful. If previously people went down into dungeons to find tools or surviving supplies, now excavations are conducted for profit. A brisk trade in items of the past is established. We see entire improvised galleries set up in surviving halls with drapes, where statues, vases, and fragments of bas-reliefs are put up for sale. The catastrophe has become a commodity. Of particular interest are paintings depicting supposedly imaginary ruins of famous buildings. For example, the Louvre. They try to convince us that the artist was simply fantasizing when painting the Grand Gallery, without a roof and in desolation in 1796, when officially everything was fine with the Louvre. But in the context of the overall picture, this looks not like fantasy, but like a fixation of reality that was later retouched in textbooks. History was rewritten, turning a planetary-scale tragedy into beautiful theatrical sets for the aristocracy's promenades. The physical traces of the catastrophe were either removed or declared antiquity. But there remained masters who understood that the truth could not be spoken directly, and they began to encrypt their messages, not in architectural landscapes, but in complex systems of symbols and allegories. Imagine the volume of work. Forge a metal floor for a medium-sized temple. That's thousands of individual elements, each of which needs to be made, fitted, connected with the others. That's months, possibly years of work by experienced blacksmiths. That's huge expenditures of metal, coal for forges, labor. And all this for a floor? For stairs? Logic suggests that such costs must have had a good justification. Metal elements in temples couldn't be just a decorative whim or tribute to fashion. They performed some important function. So important that they went to colossal expenses and technological difficulties for it. While the falsifiers of history were rewriting the chronology, turning a recent tragedy into romantic antiquity, and the artist decorators were painting carefree tourists against the backdrop of ruins, there were masters who chose a different path to preserve the truth. They understood that a direct recording of reality could be destroyed or misinterpreted by censorship. So they encrypted their messages not in architectural landscapes, but in complex systems of symbols and allegories. One of these geniuses who left us keys to understanding the mental state of society in that era was Peter Bruegel the Elder. His engravings are not just whimsical pictures, but real puzzles, the solution of which requires abandoning superficial perception. Metal floors and roads aren't the only example of amazing metal from the past. There are artifacts that raise even more questions about the real level of technological development of previous civilization. As has been rightly noted, all that is needed is to look closely. If we apply this principle to Bruegel's works, a frightening depth of moral decline opens up before us, which perhaps became the precursor to that very catastrophe. Let's consider, for example, the engraving dedicated to the vice of envy. At first glance, it is a chaotic pile of strange creatures and everyday scenes. But every detail here has a strict meaning rooted in folk wisdom and iconography that is now forgotten. The artist uses an old and persistent symbol of envy: two dogs furiously fighting over a single bone. This is not just animal aggression. It is an allegory of an endless war for resources, where two are ready to destroy each other for a miserable scrap. In the center of the composition, we see an even more sinister image: an elderly woman literally eating a heart. This grotesque visual image is a direct illustration of the idiom, "envy eats the heart." She points her finger at a turkey, which in the symbolic system of that time represented not only stupidity, but also ostentatious pomposity, greed, and unfounded pride. Bruegel shows us a vicious circle. Stupidity begets pride, pride causes envy, and envy ultimately devours the very essence of a human being, their heart. If we shift our gaze to the right part of the engraving, we can notice a strange queue of people waiting to try on shoes. This is not a market scene, but deep social satire. Shoes here act as a symbol of oppression and dependence. People voluntarily stand in line to be under the heel of envy, driving themselves into the narrow frames of others' expectations and endless comparison of themselves with others. Their hearts are already under the power of this vice. In the upper part of the composition, a funeral procession unfolds, serving as an allegory of hell or spiritual death. In a boat floating on gloomy waters, a head is depicted, next to which lies an egg. This surreal element is deciphered quite simply. The egg symbolizes reason and the birth of thought. In this context, reason has left the head, displaced by envy. Madness has gripped society. Through these eerie images, Bruegel conveys the state of civilization on the eve of, or immediately after the collapse. This is a world where reason is lost, people fight over bones like dogs, and hearts are eaten by internal malice. Perhaps it was this moral decay, this loss of human semblance, that led to the control over high technologies being lost, and cities turning into the ruins we saw in the paintings of Robert and Piranesi. The physical catastrophe was merely a consequence of a spiritual catastrophe. Thus, art ceases to be just a source of aesthetic pleasure for us. It is an encrypted book of memory, a kind of black box of a lost civilization. Engravings and paintings are documents that one must know how to read between the lines and brushstrokes. They scream to us that history is not linear and not always truthful in textbooks. But the truth always finds a way to seep through the centuries, whether in the form of extra soot on the ruins of a temple, or in the form of a strange woman eating a heart in an ancient drawing. Understanding these symbols gives us a chance not to repeat the fate of those who left us these majestic but dead cities. Shipbuilding companies spend huge amounts on fighting corrosion. Sandblasting is regularly carried out, which removes layers of rust and remnants of old paint. Then new protective coatings are applied, special anti-corrosion compounds, paint. This cycle repeats again and again, because modern metal cannot resist corrosion without constant protection. And this happens in the era of the so-called highly developed civilization that prides itself on its technological achievements. Metallurgy has reached unprecedented heights. Dozens of different alloys have been developed for different purposes. The most complex metal processing technologies exist. But creating metal that doesn't rust without protection for more than 100 years, modern science cannot do. A paradoxical situation emerges. Blacksmiths of the past, working in primitive forges, not having modern equipment and knowledge about the chemical composition of alloys, created metal with characteristics unattainable for modern industry. They produced it in such quantities that it was enough for pavements of entire streets and floors of huge temples. And nowhere did descriptions of their methods and technologies remain. The journey we have taken through the centuries, from the soot-covered vaults of ruined palaces to the sun-drenched but dead landscapes of the tourist era, forces us to completely rethink the picture of our past. We have seen two completely different worlds that official science tries to merge into one non-contradictory history textbook, but which, upon detailed examination, refuse to coexist within the traditional chronology. On one side, we are presented with the impartial testimonies of catastrophe eyewitnesses, artists who were not afraid to capture the dirt, fear, domestic disorder, and desperate attempts of survivors to adapt to a reality whose fragments were too large and complex for their understanding. Their paintings are a cry for help frozen in oil, a documentary fixation of the moment when the high technologies of the past turned into dangerous and incomprehensible decorations for a new, primitive life. All this points to one incredible theory that explains many oddities at once and connects disparate facts together. On the other side, we encountered a massive falsification, the work of the decorators of history, whose task was not to preserve memory, but to erase it, replacing the tragedy with a beautiful myth. These masters of the brush, wittingly or unwittingly, became accomplices in creating the cozy illusion in which we reside to this day. They pushed the catastrophe into a safe, distant past, turned sites of the death of millions into parks for walks and philosophical conversations, and traces of man-made accidents into a romantic patina of time. We saw how history was rewritten literally on the fly, changing the dates of artists' lives, swapping cause and effect, turning looters into collectors, and survivors in ruins into extras in antique plays. The main conclusion that suggests itself after such a deep dive is frightening in its simplicity and realism. History is possibly much closer to us than is commonly believed. Those grandiose ruins that we are used to calling antique might be the traces of a civilization that perished only a few centuries ago. We essentially live on the bones of this giant, use the remnants of its foundations, redraw its maps, but at the same time have completely forgotten the language spoken by its engineers. Bruegel and his contemporaries left us a warning encrypted in symbols. The loss of moral character, envy, and stupidity are the first steps to finding ourselves again at a broken trough, cooking stew on a bonfire in the middle of a destroyed nuclear reactor that our descendants will consider a temple to an unknown god. The art of the Ruinists ceases to be just a genre of capriccio, a play of imagination for us. These are material pieces of evidence in the case of humanity's global amnesia. To admit this means to admit that our world is fragile, and the veneer of civilization is as thin as a layer of paint on canvas. But it is precisely this knowledge that gives us a chance. The ability to read hidden messages, see inconsistencies in official versions, and ask uncomfortable questions is the only way to reconstruct the true chronology of events and understand who we really are. Heirs of a great culture, or those who forgot how plumbing works and began to worship it. We have only lifted the veil of secrecy, but behind it lies a multitude of mysteries waiting for their researcher. If this analysis has made you look at familiar paintings in a new way, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and write in the comments which other engravings you would like to see analyzed. See you in new investigations! The contrast with modernity is so sharp that it's impossible to explain it by chance or special storage conditions. Ancient metal objects are found in the most diverse climatic zones, in different types of soil, in conditions of high and low humidity, and everywhere they demonstrate amazing resistance. And modern metal rots and breaks down even with protective coatings and special care. Modern cars begin to rust after a few years of operation, especially in regions where roads are treated with salt in winter. Metal fences, poles, structures require regular painting. Any metal object left outside without protection will be covered with rust in one season. This is a fact that everyone faces. But why does ancient metal behave completely differently? Have metallurgy technologies degraded so much that we've lost the ability to produce corrosion-resistant metal? Or did knowledge and methods exist in the past that were deliberately destroyed or forgotten? Maybe this metal wasn't produced by ordinary metallurgical methods at all? All these facts form a strange picture. Metal roads hidden under asphalt, metal floors in temples that could have been part of some installations, metal that doesn't rust for centuries and millennia without any protection. Absence of historical records about all this. Impossibility of reproducing these technologies by modern methods. There's a hypothesis that at first glance seems fantastic, but explains many oddities associated with metal structures of the past. According to this theory, in the recent past, electricity was free and distributed everywhere, using technologies different from modern wired systems. And all these metal elements in buildings and on streets were part of this global energy network. It turns out that either there was a highly developed industrial base that completely disappeared without a trace, or production methods were completely different, based on principles that modern science doesn't know or doesn't recognize. In any case, we're dealing with lost knowledge and technologies, the scale of which is difficult to assess. Metal roads in this context acquire a completely different meaning. They could serve as conductors, elements of a system for transmitting or distributing energy. Perhaps the transport of that time used this energy directly, moving on metal pavements. This would explain the mass use of expensive material and complex laying technology. Roads weren't just routes of communication, but part of the energy infrastructure. Metal floors in temples also fit into this picture. If the buildings we call churches were originally power plants or energy distribution nodes, then metal floors performed the function of grounding, wiring, or part of more complex electrical circuits. The extensive use of metal in the structures of these buildings, stairs, doors, interior elements, all this could have been necessary for the system to function. Iron structures with special properties, resistant to corrosion, could have been specially created to work in this system. Perhaps the very process of their use in the electrical network somehow protected the metal from oxidation. Or the technology for producing these elements included processing that gave the metal special characteristics necessary for electrical applications, and simultaneously protected against rust. This theory also explains the complete absence of historical records. If there was a developed technological civilization with free energy available to everyone, this posed a threat to those who wanted to control resources and the population. Destroying this system and all mentions of it would be a logical step to establish control over energy resources and create people's dependence on centralized energy supply. But this theory raises new questions related to the scale of production of all these metal structures. How much labor was required to create kilometers of metal roads, huge metal floors in dozens and hundreds of buildings, thousands of various elements and details? If all this was produced manually, by blacksmiths in ordinary forges, then we're talking about fantastic volumes of work. Imagine, each element of the metal pavement needs to be forged separately. Heat the metal in the hearth to the required temperature, process with a hammer, give shape, cool. Then, assemble thousands of such elements into a single structure. This is the work of many years for large teams of blacksmiths. Multiply this by the number of city streets covered with metal, and you get work that would take decades, even with a huge number of craftsmen. This looks absurd. Such labor costs for simple road surfacing make no sense. But if metal roads were a necessary part of technological infrastructure, then the costs are justified. Just as modern civilization spends huge resources on laying electrical networks, because without them, the system doesn't work. On the other hand, if this was machine casting, if technologies for mass production of metal elements existed, then an even more important question arises. Where are these technologies now? Why can't we reproduce them? Modern industry is capable of mass casting, but it cannot create metal with the same properties as antique. Cannot produce structures that don't rust for centuries without protection. The main mystery of this whole story lies not in the technical details of metal roads or floors, not in the chemical composition of rust-proof metal, and not even in theories about free electricity. The main question sounds simpler and more frightening. Why is this being silenced? Why is information about the mass use of metal structures in the past practically absent from official sources? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about mysteries of history. Perhaps the next discovery will shed light on this mystery, or open new questions even more amazing and inexplicable. What are your versions of what's happening? How do you explain the existence of metal roads and their disappearance from historical records? Maybe you have information about similar finds in your region. Write in the comments. Let's discuss this together. The collective mind is capable of more than individual researchers. Remember, history can hide much more than we think. What we consider long studied and understood may turn out to be just a superficial layer, under which amazing technologies, forgotten knowledge, and incredible events of the past are hidden. Open any history textbook. You'll find detailed descriptions of political events, wars, changes of rulers, cultural movements. You'll read about the development of industry, about the construction of factories and plants, about the laying of railways. But nowhere will you encounter mention that city streets were covered with metal pavements. Nowhere will you find a description of the technology for creating these structures, the names of engineers who designed them, companies that produced them. Official historical sources also keep silent. There are no archival documents about orders for metal road surfaces, no estimates, calculations, reports on work done. No newspaper articles of that time admiring new technologies or criticizing them. Complete informational void around a phenomenon that should have been a significant event in the life of cities. This cannot be a simple loss of documents. We're talking about large-scale construction in dozens, possibly hundreds of settlements. It's impossible for all mentions of this to disappear by accident. Fires, wars, revolutions can destroy part of the archives, but not all at once, and not so selectively as to erase information about one specific phenomenon, leaving everything else. It remains to assume deliberate silencing. Someone, at some point, made a decision to remove this information from public access, not include it in textbooks, not mention it in official history. This assumption sounds like a conspiracy theory. But how else to explain such a complete absence of data about a phenomenon whose physical evidence is still being found under layers of asphalt? Perhaps the loss of knowledge occurred during some cataclysm, war, or social upheaval, when the old system was destroyed and the new one was built on different principles. People could deliberately distance themselves from the technologies of the past, considering them dangerous or simply incomprehensible. The next generations no longer had access to this knowledge and couldn't restore it. In any case, it's important to understand one thing. The history we're taught may be incomplete. The official version of past events doesn't always coincide with reality. Archaeological finds, accidental discoveries during road repairs, artifacts that don't fit into the accepted chronology. All this indicates the existence of blank spots in our understanding of history. Don't believe anyone at their word. Check everything yourself. This applies not only to information from this video, but to any other sources, including official textbooks and scientific publications. Critical thinking, the ability to ask questions and seek answers independently, is the only way to approach the truth. If this information was interesting and useful to you, share it with friends. The more people learn about oddities in official history, the greater the chances that someone will find additional facts, documents, or explanations. Hit like if you want to see more such investigations, more materials about forgotten technologies and unexplained artifacts of the past.